The summer of 1878 did not arrive gently in Kansas. It arrived the way most hard things arrive, without announcement, without apology, and with the full intention of staying. The heat settled into the flatlands like something that had made a decision, turning the soil to pale dust and bending the grass low until it rattled against itself in the dry wind like a field full of old bones. Mabel Holt had been traveling through it for 11 days. She sat on the bench of a hired wagon driven by a man named Grover Fitch, who smelled of axle grease and old tobacco, and who had spoken exactly 9 words since they left Wichita. That suited her. She was not in a condition for conversation. She was in a condition for survival, which is a different thing entirely, and which requires a particular quality of silence that small talk destroys. She was 34 years old. She was large in the way that some women are large solidly, substantially, in a way that took up honest space and made no apology for doing so. Her dark auburn hair had come half loose from its pins, and the road dust had turned it gray at the temples, and her face was sunburned across the nose and cheekbones from 11 days of Kansas sky with no shade worth mentioning. She wore a dark brown dress that had been respectable once, a pair of boots resoled twice, and a wool coat folded across her lap that she had not needed since Missouri but could not afford to leave behind. Between her feet sat one battered leather case. That was everything. Not lost, gone. There is a difference. Things that are lost can sometimes be found. What Thomas Graves left behind when he died in March could not be found. It could only be counted. The house in Independence, the furniture, the cookware, the garden she had kept for 9 years, 2 horses, a wagon considerably better than the one she currently occupied. All of it gone to the men Thomas had owed, who came to the door in the weeks after the funeral, with expressions ranging from apologetic to something considerably less so. The county attached what remained. The lawyer explained it in language meant to soften the blow. The blow was the blow regardless of language. But inside the lining of her wool coat, pressed flat and sewn in with small, careful stitches she had made herself by lamplight the night before the lawyers came, was something they had not taken. A sheaf of papers, thin and folded precisely, her own handwriting, a copy, made from memory and from the 1 hour she had alone with Thomas's real ledger before his brother locked the office, of every transaction Thomas Graves had made in the final 2 years of his life. Every debt, every name, every amount. She had not run from independence. That was the thing no one understood, because no one knew to ask. She had not fled in grief or in shame. She had left deliberately. After 4 months of watching and waiting and understanding exactly what kind of trouble was coming and choosing the ground on which she intended to meet it. Thomas's younger brother, a quiet man named James who had treated her with more decency than most of the Graves family ever managed, had mentioned Blackstone Ranch once, the previous winter, in the way people mention things they think might be useful without knowing why. A cattle operation outside Caldwell. Fair man running it. Always needs a cook. Hard country, but honest. Honest was enough. She was not going to Blackstone Ranch to hide. She was going there to stand. The road from Wichita to the stretch of land outside Caldwell where Blackstone Ranch sat was not a road in any meaningful sense. It was a suggestion made in dirt, running through grassland that in better years would have been green and waist-high, but now was pale yellow and crackling. She watched it pass and felt it mirrored something in her chest she did not yet have the precise word for. Grover Fitch pulled the wagon to a stop at a gate made from rough-cut timber. The word Blackstone burned into the crossbeam in letters that had weathered to the same gray as the wood. Beyond the gate, a long dirt track led to a cluster of buildings set against a sky so wide and pale it looked bleached. Main house, bunkhouse, barn, outbuildings, functional, built to last, not to impress. "This is as far as I go," Fitch said. That was 10 words, a record. Mabel picked up her case, stepped down from the wagon without assistance, and stood at the gate while the wagon turned and moved back the way it had come. She watched it go for a moment. The sound of the wheels faded into the wind. She turned toward the ranch, opened the gate, walked through it, and closed it behind her. She heard the men before she saw them clearly. 4 of them working near the barn, and they stopped what they were doing when she came through. She felt the weight of their attention land on her the way it always landed, assessing her size first, her face second, her purpose a distant third. One of them, young, maybe 19, with a sunburned neck and a hat angled at a degree that suggested he had not entirely given up on life, stood up from an overturned crate with his mouth open. She kept walking. She had learned that particular lesson early. You look back, you have already given something away. She heard something said behind her in a low voice. She heard laughter, brief and quickly swallowed. She walked to the main house, climbed the porch steps, and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Harder. "It's open," said a voice from inside. Flat, not particularly inviting. She opened the door. The front room was an office, in the sense that it contained a desk buried under papers, ledger books, and what appeared to be 3 weeks of correspondence sorted into approximate piles. A rifle leaned against the wall. A coat hung on a hook that had seen considerable work, the smell of coffee that had been on the heat too long. The man behind the desk had not looked up. Garrett Vane was in his early 40s, built the way men who work with their hands for 20 years are built, broad across the shoulders, thick in the neck, no excess anywhere. His hair was dark and going silver at the temples. His face carried the weathering of a man who spent most of his life outside in a climate that offered sun and wind in equal and unrelenting measure. He held a piece of paper in one hand and rubbed the back of his neck with the other. He looked like a man who was very tired and very pressed and was managing both things through discipline alone. "If you are selling something," he said, still without looking up. "I'm not buying. I'm not selling anything," Mabel said. "I'm looking for work." He looked up then. He took her in the way ranchers take in most things quickly, thoroughly, without sentiment. She watched him do it and did not flinch. "What kind of work?" "Cook. I heard you needed one." "Where did you hear that?" "James Graves. He said you and Thomas were acquainted." Something moved across his face at that. Not quite recognition, not quite sympathy. Somewhere between the two, Thomas Graves's wife, widow, she said, Mabel Holt. He was quiet for a moment, then he leaned back in his chair, which creaked under the shift of weight, and looked at her with an expression she could not yet fully read. "You cook professionally." "I have cooked for hired men, for family, for 2 boarding houses, and for a church fellowship of 63 people every Sunday for 4 years. I can cook for a bunkhouse. It is not a small bunkhouse. How many men?" 16, sometimes more during drive season. "I can cook for 16. He studied her. Not the quick assessment this time, but something slower and more considered. She reached into her coat and produced a folded letter, slightly worn from travel but legible. She placed it on the edge of his desk. He unfolded it, read it without comment. "Reverend Calvin Marsh," he said, "Independence Baptist. I cooked their fellowship suppers from 1872 to 1876. He folded the letter and set it down. He stood, which brought him to something over 6 feet, and moved to the window that looked out toward the bunkhouse. "My last cook quit 6 weeks ago," he said, not looking at her. "Before that, one broke his hand in a gate accident. The one before him drank. That is a diet that will make anybody difficult," Mabel said. He almost smiled. The muscles of his face considered the option and set it aside. "Cook's quarters are attached to the cookhouse," he said. "Small room, private, 40 cents a day. Meals included. You stay out of ranch business that does not concern the kitchen." She had hoped for more. It was also more than nothing, which was what she currently had. "Agreed." She said, "When do I start?" "Tonight," he said. "You can start tonight." The cookhouse was a long, low building set between the main house and the bunkhouse, connected to each by a covered walkway that blocked the wind only in theory. The kitchen ran the full length of the back wall, a large cast iron range that had seen better years but still functioned, a long prep table, shelves of canned goods, a root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the floor, and hooks on the wall hung with tools in no particular system. The cook's quarters beyond the kitchen door were, as Garrett had said, small. A narrow bed frame with a corn husk mattress, a washstand, a wooden chair, a single hook on the wall, a window looking out over the back pasture. Mabel set her case on the chair and stood in the middle of the room for a moment. She allowed herself to feel how small it was and how far she had fallen from the house in Independence. Then she set that feeling aside because it was not useful. She rolled up her sleeves and went back to the kitchen. The first hour she spent taking stock. She went through every shelf, every crate, every sack. She opened the root cellar and stood at the top of the ladder with a lamp and looked at what was there. She made a mental list that was simultaneously an inventory and an assessment and a plan, because that is what cooking for a large number of people actually is. It is logistics dressed in the language of food. What she found was not encouraging. Supplies stored in no order, with nothing tracking what was running low versus what was abundant. Duplicates of some things, complete absence of others, things that had turned or were turning, taking up space that should have been cleared weeks ago. A sack of flour that had gone to weevils, which meant everything near it needed checking. Cornmeal, a barrel of dried beans, cured ham hanging, canned tomatoes, dried onions, coffee. She cataloged the problems and then she started cooking. What she made that first night was not complicated. She had a gift for understanding what food needed to become, a thing she had known since she was a girl in her mother's kitchen in Ohio. The beans had been sitting plain, and she found a ham bone and bay leaves and black pepper and dried thyme, and the beans became something different. She made cornbread in the cast iron skillet in batches until the shelf was stacked with it, golden and still warm. She found dried apples in a crate she almost missed and made a cobbler in the Dutch oven with brown sugar and a cinnamon stick she had been carrying in her own case because she never traveled without it. She rang the supper bell at 7 o'clock exactly. They came in with the particular wariness of men who have been disappointed by food too many times to hope without evidence. They sat along the long wooden benches, hats off, and looked at the table with expressions ranging from cautious to outright skeptical. The smell hit them before the first pot was fully on the table. She watched something shift in the room, a collective softening, small and real, the way a crowd leans toward something without meaning to. The young man with the angled hat, the one from the crate, caught her eye across the room and gave her a nod that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. She would learn later his name was Clem Rafferty, 19 years old, from eastern Tennessee, perpetually underprepared for Kansas in every conceivable way. Garrett came in late. He came quietly, took a seat at the far end of the table, accepted the bowl passed to him without ceremony, and ate. She watched from the kitchen doorway without hovering. She saw him eat 2 full bowls and 2 pieces of cornbread and a serving of cobbler. When he was finished, he sat with his coffee cup in both hands, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to stillness she had seen from him. He said nothing, but he stayed at the table longer than the other men. The foreman, a man of 55 named Silas Drum, found her in the kitchen while she was washing up. He had the eyes of a man who noticed everything and the voice of a man who chose carefully what to say about it. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" "Ohio," she said, not looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. "Missouri. Practice." He leaned against the doorframe. "They are saying in the bunkhouse that you will not last 2 weeks. She looked up then. "What do you say?" He considered it with the unhurried patience of someone who had formed his opinion before he asked the question. "I say you might surprise some people," he said. He pushed off the doorframe and went to go, then stopped. "They were going to lose the ranch in October," he said, quiet and careful. "If the Rollins buyer falls through, Garrett has not told you that. I'm telling you so you understand what you have walked into." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you are going to figure it out anyway," he said, "and I would rather you know it than stumble into it." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone. Then she turned back to the dishes and finished cleaning up. Her second morning at Blackstone began at 4:30. She was in the kitchen by 5, fire built, coffee on. When she heard movement in the yard and looked out to see Garrett crossing from the main house to the barn in the pre-dawn dark with a lantern, she watched him go. She went back to biscuits. Breakfast was biscuits, salt pork, eggs from the 18 hens in the coop behind the cookhouse that needed better feed, which she added to her mental list. Coffee and oatmeal with dried fruit, on the table by 6:15. While the men ate, she began her second inventory. This one was systematic. She had found a sheet of paper and a stub of pencil on the kitchen shelf, and she went through everything: quantities, conditions, what was needed urgently and what could wait. By mid-morning, she had a clear picture, and it was not good. On the third day, a delivery wagon came from Caldwell. Raymond Goss, the supply man, was 45 years old, broad in the gut, with an oilskin jacket and the particular easy manner of a man accustomed to not being questioned. He brought the order, stacked it in the kitchen, produced his bill of lading with a flourish. Mabel looked at the paper, looked at the stack of flour sacks, picked one up. She found the kitchen scale on the prep table and set the sack on it. The needle settled. 42 pounds, she said. Goss smiled the way men smile when they are deciding how to manage a situation. Those scales have always run a little low, he said. Old spring. You get used to it. The bill says 50 pounds. Mabel said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She set the paper next to the scale and looked at him. Goss's smile did not change, but something behind it did. I will make it right on the next delivery, he said. You can adjust the bill now, she said, or bring the remainder. Either way suits me, but I will be recording this in the kitchen log, and I will be weighing everything from this point forward. Goss collected his bill, made a notation she could not read from across the table, tipped his hat, and left. Mabel watched his wagon roll out through the gate. Then she opened the drawer beneath the coffee shelf, where she had already noticed a collection of old bills of lading going back 3 months. She spread them across the prep table and sat down with her pencil and her paper. It took her most of the afternoon. The discrepancies were not accidents. They were consistent, small enough to miss if you were not looking, large enough to accumulate, weights slightly off, prices on certain items listed above the standard rates she had checked at the Wichita Dry Goods before she left, 3 months of records, $60 conservatively, probably more if there were older receipts somewhere she had not yet found. She folded the paper, marked the individual bills, and put them in her apron pocket. She did not take them to Garrett that evening. She needed to be certain the number was right, and she needed to understand more about the ranch before she walked through that office door with accusations. A woman who arrives with nothing and immediately tells the man who hired her that his operation is being robbed is a woman who needs to be trusted first, and trust is not built in 3 days. She built it the way she built everything, through consistency and through competence and through showing up every morning at 4:30 regardless of what the previous day had cost her. Clem Rafferty began appearing at the kitchen door every afternoon. He hauled water when the barrels ran low, carried crates from the root cellar, moved things she pointed at without being asked twice. He was not doing it out of chivalry. He was doing it because the kitchen was warm and the food smelled like something he had not smelled since Tennessee. And he was 19 years old and a long way from home and did not have the vocabulary for any of that yet. She understood. She let him haul water and sometimes gave him something to eat before the others came in and didn't make conversation about it. Silas Drum began stopping at the kitchen table most mornings with his coffee. He read the newspaper when there was one. He did not explain why he preferred the kitchen table to the bunkhouse common room, and she did not ask. Garrett Vane stopped avoiding the cookhouse. It had been his pattern the first week to come to meals with the men, eat, and leave. The shift was small. He started arriving a few minutes before the others and pouring his own coffee from the pot on the stove. He would stand at the window with it and look out at the range. She would work around him. They would exchange perhaps 4 words. Then the men would come in and the meal would happen. One morning in the 3rd week, she was standing at the same window looking out at the eastern pasture while the first light came over the ridge. And he came in and poured his coffee and stood beside her, and they looked at the same thing for a moment without speaking. You are up earlier than I expected, he said finally. I've always been an early riser. Where are you from originally? Before independence? Ohio. Family farmed. You do not farm like a woman who farmed. She looked at him. My mother farmed. She said, I kept the books. He nodded slowly. The way he nodded at information he was still deciding what to do with. She went to Caldwell without telling him. She borrowed a horse from the corral, asked Clem to saddle it for her, and rode into town and back in a single day in the August heat. She met with the dry goods dealer and with 2 other suppliers and came back with a written agreement for better prices and a renegotiated delivery schedule. The terms set down on paper she had drafted herself at the dealer's counter while he watched her with an expression she had seen before on men who were recalibrating something. Garrett was in the yard when she rode in. He watched her dismount without comment. He did not say anything until that evening, when he came to the kitchen after supper. You went to Caldwell alone, he said. Yes. You did not ask about taking a wagon? I managed. I know you managed. He paused. I'm saying you should have asked. She thought about that. She understood what he was saying. Not criticism. Something clumsier and more genuine than criticism, the specific awkwardness of a man who has been alone a long time, offering to share a burden he cannot quite bring himself to name directly. I will ask next time, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and was almost to the door when he stopped. The cobbler was good tonight, he said. Not turning around. It is the same recipe I always use. I know, he said. I just wanted to say it. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. She noticed something she had not felt in a very long time, the specific sensation of being in a place that might eventually be all right. She went back to the dishes and finished cleaning up without making anything of it. She had been at Blackstone 3 weeks when she took the bills of lading to Garrett. She knocked on his office door in the late morning, sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, and set the paper and the marked receipts on his desk. "I need to talk to you about the kitchen accounts," she said. He looked at the stack. He looked at her. She walked him through it, every discrepancy marked, every calculation shown. The total arrived at carefully and conservatively. $60 over 3 months, likely more if there were older records. He picked up the receipts. He read them. His jaw tightened in the way she was beginning to recognize as his tell for things that were worse than he had been prepared to find. "Who kept track of the kitchen accounts before? Whoever the cook was," she said. "Has anyone checked them?" A pause. "Not recently." She had expected that. She put the second sheet of paper on the desk, the one with her recommendations, a different supplier for staples, a renegotiated arrangement with Goss if they chose to keep him, a proper inventory system going forward with stock rotated and tracked on the board she had already hung on the kitchen wall. "I'm not trying to create problems," she said, "but I cannot run the kitchen properly if the accounting underneath it is wrong." He was quiet. She had the sense of being assessed again, but differently than before. Not whether she was capable, whether she was trustworthy. That is a more complicated evaluation and takes longer. "What do you recommend about Goss?" he said at last. "Go to him in person," she said, "not by order. With the receipts, let him see you have the numbers." He looked at the papers again. He rubbed his face with one hand in the gesture she was coming to recognize as his response to situations that had turned out worse than expected. "All right," he said. "Write me the full list." She reached into her apron and placed the third sheet of paper on his desk. She had written it 2 days ago. Something passed across his face, not quite a smile, the territory just south of one. By the end of her 4th week, the kitchen ran differently. Shelves labeled, stock rotated, a log on the wallboard, a proper relationship with 2 new suppliers in Caldwell, both of whom she had met in person and both of whom had come away from those meetings with the clear understanding that bills of lading would be checked against actual weights. The mood in the bunkhouse changed. Not dramatically and not all at once. It changed the way things change in hard places slowly, almost suspiciously, as if the men expected it to be temporary and were waiting for it to collapse. But better meals kept happening, and after enough of them. The mood shifted in a way that had nothing to do with food exactly, and everything to do with what consistent care does to people who have gone without it for a while. They started talking to her. Not all of them, and not about anything important at first. But Clem Rafferty appeared at the kitchen door every afternoon, and Silas Drum drank his coffee at the kitchen table and sometimes set down the newspaper and said something. And 2 of the older hands began arriving to meals a few minutes early and helping set out the bowls without being asked. And one evening in her 4th week, a Friday, Mabel was in the herb garden on the south side of the cookhouse. She had found it in the 2nd week, gone entirely to weeds, and had been bringing it back slowly in whatever spare minutes the kitchen allowed. The sage, the thyme, the rosemary. She was kneeling in the dirt with her hands in the soil when she heard voices on the other side of the fence. Garrett and Silas. Not loud, not meant to be overheard. "Cannot make the October payment if the Rollins buyer falls through," Garrett was saying. "He is not going to fall through," Silas said, though his voice carried no certainty. "He has sent 3 letters asking for delays. 3. That is a man buying time. Not cattle." A silence. "We have the North Herd. The North Herd is not enough. What are you going to do?" A long pause. "I do not know yet." She stayed still in the garden until their footsteps moved away. She stayed there a while longer after she was certain they were gone. Then she stood up, her knees protesting the ground, and looked at the row of herbs she had brought back from nearly dead. She went back inside and started on dinner. But she was thinking. She was thinking the way she thought when a problem had presented itself, and she was deciding whether it was hers to solve. That night, late, she sat at the kitchen table by lamplight. She opened her wool coat, found the seam she had made with small, careful stitches, and worked it open. She drew out the folded papers, her own handwriting, from months ago. In the kitchen in Independence, with Thomas's real ledger spread open before her and 1 hour to work before the door would be locked again. She unfolded them on the table and smoothed them flat with both hands. The name was there. Conrad Wick. written twice in Thomas's hand, in a section of the ledger that she suspected no one else had ever been meant to see. She looked at those 2 entries for a long time. Then she folded the papers carefully, tucked them back into the lining of the coat, and set the coat on the chair beside her. She blew out the lamp. She did not go to bed immediately. She sat in the dark kitchen with her hands on the table and listened to the Kansas night, the wind moving through the grass, the distant sound of cattle, the slow turning of the windmill. She had known Conrad Wick would come. She had built toward this moment for 4 months without calling it by that name. She had chosen Blackstone for its distance and its stability, and because a man named James Graves had described Garrett Vane as fair. And fairness was the one thing she had needed most and found least in the last year of her life. She had come here to stand, not to hide, not to wait. And now she almost had what she needed: a place that knew her, a record that showed her worth, and a document inside her coat that told the truth about a man who intended to find her. She got up. She put the lamp away. She walked to the window over the sink and looked out into the dark yard. A horse stood at the gate, not one she recognized, a rider sitting very still in the saddle, looking toward the cookhouse, toward the lit window where she stood, not moving, not calling out. She stood very still herself. The rider looked for a long moment, then he turned the horse and rode away into the dark without a sound. And the night closed back over the road as if he had not been there at all. Mabel's hand went to her coat on the chair, to the seam, to the papers inside it. She had thought she had more time. She had been wrong about the timeline, not about anything else. She turned from the window, pulled the coat around her shoulders, and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark to wait for morning. Morning came the way it always did on the Kansas plain, without ceremony, without concern for the person waiting for it. Just a slow, gray lightning along the eastern ridge that had nothing in it of comfort and everything in it of inevitability. Mabel had not slept. She had sat at the kitchen table until the darkness began to thin. And then she had built the fire and put the coffee on and started the biscuits, because whatever was coming, the men still needed to eat. She did not tell Garrett about the rider that night. Not yet. She had learned, in 12 years of managing things, that Thomas refused to see clearly. That information delivered too early, before you understood its full shape, was often worse than no information at all. She needed to know what she was dealing with before she named it out loud. Naming a thing too soon gave it a shape you could not take back. So she worked, she cooked, she watched the gate. 3 days passed without incident. On the 4th morning, she went to Garrett's office. She sat down without waiting to be invited, the same as always, and placed the marked bills of lading and her written calculations on his desk. He had already seen them once. This time she placed a second sheet beside them, one she had been working on since the inventory, listing not just the kitchen losses but the pattern she had noticed in how the ranch managed its broader supply chain, ordering reactively instead of systematically, paying premium prices for items that could be purchased in bulk at lower cost with a standing arrangement. No forward planning for seasonal changes in feed and provisions. "I want to show you something," she said. He looked at both sheets. He read them in the deliberate way he read everything, going through once quickly and then returning to the parts that required more thought. "This is not just about Goss," he said. "No." She said, "Goss is the most visible problem. He is not the only one." He set the papers down and looked at her for a moment in the quiet way he had, the way that meant he was deciding something rather than reacting to something. "How long have you been working on this?" "Since the 2nd week," she said. "You have been here 4 weeks. "Yes." He was quiet again. Outside, the sound of the men crossing from the bunkhouse to the barn in the early morning. Boots on dry ground, the distant complaint of a gate hinge that needed oil. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. She had the 3rd sheet ready. He almost smiled when she put it on the desk. She walked him through it. The recommendations were specific and practical. A standing order with the Caldwell dry goods dealer at rates she had already confirmed were available. A forward purchasing schedule for the winter provisions, a tracking system for the kitchen accounts that she would maintain and he could review at the end of each month. He agreed to all of it, not enthusiastically, not with any particular expression at all, but with the kind of direct assent that she had come to understand was his version of enthusiasm. She was at the door when he said, without looking up from the desk, "You have done this kind of work before." It was not a question. "I kept the books for my husband's business," she said. "For most of our marriage." He nodded once, slowly. She went back to the kitchen. Silas found her there an hour later. He came around to the back of the cookhouse, the way he sometimes did when he wanted a conversation that would not be overheard. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his expression arranged in the particular way it arranged itself when he was about to deliver something he considered important. "I was in town yesterday," he said. She kept her hands moving on the dough she was working. He continued, "There is a man staying at the Caldwell boarding house, has been there 2 days. Dark coat, Eastern cut, asks questions about the ranch, about Garrett, about whether Blackstone is having financial difficulties." She pressed the dough flat and did not look up. "What kind of questions?" "The kind a man asks when he is trying to establish what something is worth before he makes a move on it." Silas said, "Carl Brewer at the feed store told me the man mentioned your name." "Not directly. He asked whether Garrett had taken on any new staff recently, whether anyone had come from Missouri." She lifted the dough, turned it, pressed it again. "What does he look like?" she said. Silas described him. She already knew before he finished. She had known from the gate, from the rider 3 nights ago. But hearing it from Silas made it a different kind of fact, the kind that had to be dealt with rather than prepared for. "His name is Conrad Wick," she said. She set down the dough and wiped her hands on her apron. "He was associated with my husband, not as a creditor, not the way the court understood it. He positioned himself as a middleman between Thomas and the men Thomas actually borrowed from. He collected a percentage from both sides and kept nothing on paper that could be used against him in a proceeding." Silas was very still. "Does he have a claim against you?" "Not a legal one. The estate was settled by the court in April. Every documented debt was addressed. Conrad Wick's name did not appear in the formal accounting because Conrad Wick was careful never to leave documentation that would put him in a courtroom. Then, why is he here? Because men like Conrad do not operate through courtrooms," she said. "They operate through pressure, through reputation, through making you believe that what they want from you is easier to give than to resist." She picked up the dough again. Her hands were steady. She was aware of that and registered it as useful information about herself. "I need to tell Garrett," she said. "Yes," Silas said. "You do. That evening, after supper, after the men had cleared out and the ranch had settled into its nighttime, quieter version of itself." Mabel walked across the yard to the main house and knocked on the office door. "Come in," Garrett said. She sat down. She told him plainly and without elaboration, Conrad Wick, Thomas's gambling arrangements, the estate settlement, what Silas had heard in town, the rider at the gate 3 nights ago. She told it the way she had told Silas, with the facts in order and the emotion set to one side. She had practiced that particular delivery for a long time. When she finished, Garrett was quiet. He looked at the desk surface in front of him rather than at her, which she had come to understand was not avoidance, but concentration. "He has no legal standing," she said. "I want to be clear about that. The documentation I have from the court is complete." "I heard you," Garrett said. He stood and moved to the window. Outside, the yard was dark and still. "A man comes to my county asking about someone who works for me. He said, 'I'm going to have thoughts about that.'" She watched the set of his shoulders. "I'm not asking you to manage this," she said. "I know you are not." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "I'm telling you where I stand. Whatever that man is planning, he does not get to plan it quietly." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in his face she had not seen before. Not protectiveness exactly, something more like principle. The specific anger of a man who has decided that a certain kind of behavior will not be permitted on his ground. "All right," she said. "You will tell me if anything happens," he said, "before you try to handle it yourself." She started to say she always handled things herself. Then she stopped, because he was not asking her to be less capable. He was asking her not to be alone. And those were different things, even if she had spent long enough treating them as the same thing that the distinction required a moment to find. "I will tell you," she said. She went back to the kitchen. She cleaned what was already clean and organized what was already organized because she needed her hands doing something. Outside, the October wind moved across the prairie, and somewhere in the direction of Caldwell, Conrad Wick was sitting in a boarding house room building his plan, and she could feel the weight of it, the way you feel a storm that has not yet arrived, a pressure change in the air. But under the weight of it was something else, something she had not felt in the years she had spent in Thomas's house, learning to manage everything alone because there was no one else to manage it. She was still alone in the sense that mattered. This was her fight, her history, her name at stake. But alone and without company were not the same thing. She had spent the last 4 months learning what it felt like to be in a place where her size was a fact rather than a verdict, where the work she did was the measure of her and nothing else. She had not known how much that distinction mattered until she had lived inside it. She found a third problem 2 nights later, buried in a section of the ranch ledger she had not reached yet. Garrett had left the book on the kitchen table after their conversation, and she had been working through it methodically each evening after the men had eaten and the kitchen was quiet. A service contract with a man named Walt Morrison, drawn up 3 years prior to manage water rights on the north boundary. The payments were current, the service was not. She went back through the ranch correspondence until she found the letter from Morrison dated 18 months ago, 3 lines, stating that the arrangement could no longer be maintained. Garrett had filed it and apparently not revisited the contract it referenced, 18 months of payments for work that had stopped. She added the number to her running total and turned the lamp down and sat in the dark kitchen for a moment, with the specific tiredness of a person who keeps finding things that should have been found sooner. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote it all down, because that was the only answer to that kind of tiredness. Conrad Wick arrived at Blackstone on a Tuesday morning. Mabel was in the kitchen when she heard the horses in the yard, and she went to the window and looked out. And there he was. He was exactly as she remembered him. That was the first thing she registered, how entirely unchanged he was, as if the 3 years since she had last seen him had passed differently for him than for everyone else. The dark coat was good wool, city quality, wrong for the Kansas flatlands in the deliberate way of a man who wanted to be perceived as coming from somewhere more important. He was 38 or 39, dark-haired, with the easy posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and finding them already arranged to his advantage. There was a second man with him, younger, thinner, with the careful, neutral expression of a professional who was being paid to observe rather than to feel. He carried a leather satchel and kept slightly behind Conrad in the manner of someone who understood his function precisely. Mabel recognized the type before she knew the name, Pinkerton, or something close to it, a man who found people for money and delivered paperwork when he found them. She stayed at the window long enough to confirm what she already knew. Then she went back to the counter and finished what she was doing, because the biscuits did not care about Conrad Wick. Clem Rafferty knocked on the kitchen door 3 minutes later with the expression of someone trying very hard to appear casual and failing entirely. "There's a man in the yard asking for you," he said. "I know," she said. "Tell him I will be out shortly." Clem hovered. He was 19, and he had the instincts of someone who cared about outcomes even when caring was not strategically useful. "Garrett is in the barn," he said. "I could go and—" "I will handle it," she said. "Go on." She finished the biscuits. She set them to rise. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook. She smoothed the front of her dress, which was the dark brown one, worn and clean, and she walked out through the kitchen door and down the porch steps and into the yard. Conrad turned when he heard her and arranged his expression into something warm, which made it worse. "Mabel," he said, "you are a hard woman to find." She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She did not go closer. She had learned early with Conrad that proximity was a thing he used. "I did not know I was being looked for," she said. 300 miles is a long way to come from independence," he said, "though I understand why a person might want to put distance between herself and a difficult season. What do you want?" "Conrad." He tilted his head slightly, as if the directness surprised him, though nothing surprised Conrad Wick. He was a man who anticipated everything and performed surprise as a social courtesy. "I want to talk," he said. "You and I have unfinished business." "I have no unfinished business with you." Thomas did. Thomas is dead. What Thomas owed was addressed by the Pottawatomie County Court in April. I have the documents. He smiled wider, the kind of smile that meant the conversation was going the direction he had planned for it. "The court settled what was on record," he said. "But there are obligations that do not go through courts." "Mabel." Thomas borrowed considerably from parties who preferred discretion. The estate barely covered the formal debts. The rest— he spread one hand in a gesture of elegant reasonableness. "The rest does not belong to me," she said. "I was his wife. I am not his estate." He let a silence sit. He was skilled at silences. She remembered that from Thomas's parlor, Conrad standing in one long enough to make Thomas fill it with concessions. Thomas always filled them. He could not help it. She did not fill it. Something moved behind Conrad's eyes. A small recalibration. You have gotten harder, he said. I have gotten accurate, she said. There is a difference. The second man, the one with the satchel, opened the clasp and removed a folded document. He held it without offering it, waiting. Conrad nodded at him. Thomas borrowed money through arrangements I facilitated. Conrad said, those arrangements generated an obligation of $420. Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to accept $300. I think that is reasonable. Given what? She said. Given your situation here. He looked around the yard with the appraising manner she had seen him use before, cataloging what things were worth. A cook's position on a cattle ranch outside Caldwell. He paused. That is a precarious way to live. Mabel, dependent on everything going correctly, on the ranch being in good standing, on the employer having no reason to reconsider his staffing decisions. There it was. She had wondered how long it would take him to reach it. Less time than she had hoped. Are you threatening my employment? She said. I am observing, he said pleasantly. I am noting that a woman in your position might benefit from resolving old uncertainties. $300 is a small price for a clean start. The second man extended the document toward her. She looked at it without taking it. What is that? She said. A formalization of the arrangement. Conrad said, a record of the debt and the agreed settlement. She looked at it for another moment. Then she looked at the man holding it, and she looked at his hands, and she looked at the document itself with the particular attention she had been trained toward by years of checking ledgers and receipts and contracts for the things that did not add up. She did not take it. I would like to see that document, said a voice from behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She had heard the footsteps crossing from the barn. She had registered Garrett's presence behind her, the way you register weather as a fact of the environment that changes what is possible. Garrett came to stand about 6 feet to her right. He didn't stand in front of her. He stood beside her, which was a different thing, and one she noted. He held out his hand toward the man with the satchel. The man looked at Conrad. Conrad looked at Garrett with the expression of someone recalibrating for a variable he had not fully accounted for. He nodded at the man, who gave the document to Garrett. Garrett read it. He read it the way he read everything slowly, going back to the parts that required more attention. His face did not change while he was reading. When he finished, he lowered it and looked at Conrad. This document records a debt between Thomas Graves and parties unnamed. He said, it names Mabel Holt as assuming that debt by marital association. He paused. That is not how debt assumption works under Kansas territorial law. I am not a lawyer, Conrad said pleasantly. No, Garrett said, you are not. He handed the document back to the man with the satchel. Not to Conrad, to the man, a deliberate distinction. You are on my land, Garrett said. You have made what sounds like a threat against a member of my household regarding her employment. I'm going to ask you to leave now. Conrad looked at Mabel. Something in his expression had thinned to what was underneath the pleasantness, which was not rage but something colder. Contempt, maybe. The contempt of a man who has planned a thing carefully and encountered resistance where he expected compliance. We will continue this conversation another time, he said to her. This conversation is finished, she said. Conrad mounted his horse with the smooth, unhurried movement of a man who had decided to let this round go without conceding anything fundamental. The second man followed. They rode out through the gate and turned toward Caldwell without looking back. Mabel stood in the yard until the sound of the hooves faded. She breathed. She looked at the Kansas sky, which was the pale blue of late September, with clouds moving fast from the northwest. She let her shoulders come down from where they had been, let the yard come back to its ordinary sounds, let herself return to the ground she was standing on. Garrett came to stand near her. He left space between them, the appropriate distance of a man who understood that what had just happened belonged to her and not to him. You all right? He said. I'm going to be. She said. He nodded. He was here before I bought Blackstone, she said after a moment. Conrad, that kind of man. He finds people in trouble and he inserts himself at the point of greatest pressure and he extracts what he can before the trouble resolves. I have met the type, Garrett said. He is not finished, she said. He will go to Caldwell and he will talk to people. He has already been talking to people. Silas told me. I know. Garrett said. She looked at him. Silas told me 2 days ago. He said, I have been thinking about how to handle it. She registered this. He had known and had not said anything and had let her come to him in her own time. She did not know what to do with that immediately, so she filed it alongside the other things she was still sorting through. He will say that Blackstone is financially troubled, she said. He will say that you have hired a woman with a disreputable history. He will make both things sound connected. If people in Caldwell believe the ranch is failing and believe that the cook is the reason, your creditors will hear about it. I know what he is doing, Garrett said. Then what do we do? He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was not avoiding the question but taking it seriously. We go to Caldwell, he said. Before he finishes building his story, you take your court documents and we go to Caldwell on market day when the people who have been listening to him are all in one place. She looked at him. That is not a protection, she said. That is a confrontation. Yes, he said, it is. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about 12 years of managing things by being careful and quiet and staying out of the way of people with more authority and louder voices. She thought about where that strategy had ended. He will be there, she said. Conrad will be there. I expect so. I'm not asking you to fight him, she said. I know you are not. I mean that, she said. This is my fight. These are my documents. If I go to Caldwell and I stand in the street and I say what is true, it has to be me saying it, not you standing in front of me saying it on my behalf. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted to something more open. I understand that, he said. I will be there. I will not be in front of you. She thought about it. She thought about Conrad's confidence when he had ridden in that morning, the certainty of a man who had planned for the variables he expected and had not planned for the ones he had not. He had not planned for her to have this. She went back to the kitchen and opened her coat and worked the stitching loose and unfolded the papers on the prep table for the second time. She read through them again, slowly, tracing the lines of Thomas's handwriting and then her own handwriting beside it, the translation she had made in the 1 hour she had been given. Conrad Wick's name appeared twice, not as a creditor, as a facilitator, a man who had arranged the introduction between Thomas and the men Thomas actually borrowed from, and who had taken a percentage from each transaction for that arrangement. He had never lent Thomas $1 directly. He had positioned himself between Thomas and the money and collected from both sides. And he had done it in a way that generated no paperwork in his name, because he understood that paperwork in his name would be the thing that ended him. Which meant the document he had brought this morning, the one naming Mabel as inheriting Thomas's debt, was not a formalization of anything real. It was a fabrication, a constructed claim to a debt that had never been his to hold. She folded the papers and held them flat between both palms and stood at the prep table for a long moment. He had built his entire approach on the assumption that she would not know this, that she would see the official-looking document in the Pinkerton man and the confident posture, and she would calculate that paying was easier than fighting. He had made the same mistake Thomas had always made. He had assumed that because she was large and plain-spoken and without obvious allies, she did not understand precisely what was on the paper she was looking at. She put the documents back in the lining of her coat and stitched it closed again with quick, careful stitches. Then she went to the wallboard and updated the kitchen accounts for the week, because that was work that needed doing, and she was a woman who did the work that needed doing. Silas found her there later that afternoon. He came in quietly and poured himself a coffee and stood with it. He's going to be in Caldwell Saturday, Silas said. Market day. He was asking Carl Brewer about which days the most people are in town. She kept her eyes on the board. Then Saturday, she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. I will ride with you, he said. Not in front, behind. She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had made a decision before he came into the room and was informing her of it rather than requesting permission, but doing so in the manner of someone who understood the difference between support and interference. She nodded. She spent the next 3 days working. She kept the kitchen running, fed the men, updated the accounts, taught Clem Rafferty how the inventory system worked because she had decided it was time someone else understood it, and Clem had proven, beneath the 19-year-old exterior, to be considerably more capable than he appeared. She also wrote out, in her clearest handwriting, a summary of the court documents and what they showed about Conrad Wick's position, legal and otherwise, in relation to Thomas's estate. She had found, over years of presenting numbers to men who did not want to hear what the numbers said, that the only thing more powerful than a true fact was a true fact stated in a way that could not be misunderstood. On Friday evening, Garrett came to the kitchen after supper. He set his coffee cup on the counter and stood at the window. Are you ready? He said. I've been ready since April, she said. I just needed the right place to stand. He was quiet for a moment. Tell me what you need tomorrow, he said. For you to be there, she said. Not in front of me, not speaking for me, just there. He nodded once. She looked at him. The lamp on the table between them made the kitchen warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. She thought about the man who had crossed that yard with a lantern in the pre-dawn dark while she stood at the window and made biscuits. She thought about the way he had read the bills of lading and said, "All right," without ceremony. The way he had told her she did not need to go to Caldwell alone, meaning something more complicated than the words themselves. The way he had stood beside her that morning in the yard and not in front of her. She was 34 years old and she had been careful for a long time. She intended to stay careful, but careful and blind were different things, and she had stopped being blind some weeks ago without quite deciding to. She went to bed earlier than usual. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the window and felt not afraid but alert, the specific alertness of someone who has been preparing for something long enough that the preparation has become its own kind of steadiness. Morning would come. It always did. She woke before the gray came up over the eastern ridge. She lay still for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of what the day was going to ask of her. Then she got up, because there was no other answer to that kind of morning. She dressed carefully. The dark blue dress, the best one she had, which was not fine but was clean and carried itself with a plain-spoken dignity she had always appreciated in clothes. Over it, the brown leather riding coat with the silver buttons at the cuff, the one she had bought in Independence with money she had saved before Thomas's debts reached that account. Boots, high-cuffed, dark, resoled once and still good. She pinned her hair up properly for the first time in weeks. Auburn and stubborn, and she looked at herself in the small wavy mirror above the washstand for approximately 3 seconds, which was enough. She was a large woman. She had always been a large woman. She had spent considerable years in the company of people who treated that as the most important thing about her, and she had spent the last 4 months at Blackstone Ranch in the company of people who treated it as one unremarkable fact among many. She knew which version of the world she was walking into today. She intended to walk into it on her own terms regardless. She went to the kitchen, built the fire, put the coffee on, made enough biscuits for the men's breakfast, and left everything laid out with a note for Clem in handwriting, clear enough that he could not misread it. She had spent 2 afternoons teaching him the kitchen systems. He would manage. She was at the cookhouse door with her coat buttoned and her document case under her arm when Garrett crossed the yard from the main house in the early dark. He stopped when he saw her and looked at her for a moment without speaking. He was wearing his good hat and his work coat, and he looked like what he was, a man of the land, solid and unembellished, who had decided that today required his presence somewhere. "Ready," he said. She nodded. Silas came around from the barn leading 3 horses. He handed Mabel's reins to her without ceremony and mounted his own horse in the practiced way of a man who had been doing it since before Kansas was a state. They rode into Caldwell as the sun cleared the ridge. Caldwell on market day was the nearest thing the territory offered to a social event. Wagons lined the main street from the feed store to the dry goods. Ranch hands and homestead families moving through the easy familiarity of people who shared the same hard weather and the same hard ground. The smell of horses and sawdust and coffee from the open door of the hotel dining room. The sound of commerce conducted without ceremony. Mabel had been to Caldwell twice before, once for the supplier negotiation, once for a special order of spices. She had been transactional both times, in and out, head down, business concluded. She had built no particular presence here. Conrad Wick had been here 5 days. He had built a considerable one. She felt it when they rode in. Not dramatically. Not the way you feel a crowd turn against you in a story. More the way you feel a room change temperature, a certain quality to the glances that found her. A certain settling of attention as people registered who she was and what it meant that she was here. Conrad had done his work well. He was a thorough man. Conrad was standing in front of the saloon when she dismounted. He had positioned himself there with the instinct of a man who understood sightlines and audiences. He watched her cross the street toward him with an expression that was almost pleased, the almost being the significant part. Lyle Pratt was beside him, the satchel over his shoulder, the same careful, neutral expression as before. Mabel stopped in the middle of the street, not at the edge of it, not on the boardwalk, in the middle, where the space was open and the light was good and anyone on either side could see her without difficulty. She raised her voice to a level that carried without straining. "Conrad," she said. He came off the saloon step with the smooth movement of a man who had rehearsed his entrance. Several people nearby had already oriented toward them, the two men outside the dry goods, the woman from the millinery who had stepped to her doorway, Carl Brewer from the feed store who had stopped loading his wagon and was watching with the particular attention of a man who had been part of the audience for 5 days and was now witnessing something he had not anticipated. "Mabel?" Conrad said. "And Garrett Vane." He looked past her with the expression of a man noting a variable. Garrett did not respond. Silas had positioned himself at an angle near the horses, unhurried, visible. "I understand you have been having conversations in this town about me," Mabel said. "For 5 days, I'm told. I think it is time to have that conversation properly, and in front of the people who have been listening to it." Conrad tilted his head. His pleasant expression did not waver. "I have only been telling people what I know," he said. "Then tell them here," she said. She opened the document case. She had organized it the night before in the kitchen by lamplight, each paper in the order she would need it, edges aligned, nothing to fumble for. She lifted the first document and held it up. "This is the estate settlement from Pottawatomie County, Kansas," she said, "filed April 1878. It lists every creditor Thomas Graves had a documented obligation to at the time of his death and the disposition of each claim. Every legitimate debt Thomas carried was addressed through this proceeding. There were no hidden assets. I did not conceal anything. I did not have anything to conceal." She looked at Conrad directly. "If you have documentation of a transaction between yourself and Thomas, a signed note, a witnessed agreement, anything with legal standing, I'm asking you to produce it." The watching group had grown. She was aware of it in her peripheral vision without looking at it directly. This was a skill she had developed over years, knowing what was in a room without appearing to scan it. Conrad spread his hands in the gesture of elegant reasonableness she had seen him use before. "The nature of Thomas's arrangements with me were informal," he said, "conducted between gentlemen on the basis of trust." "Informal," she said. "Yes, so you have no documentation. Thomas's word," he said. "His personal assurance. Thomas is dead," she said. "His word ended with him. What you have is a memory of a private conversation with a man who cannot confirm it, and a claim against a woman who is not party to that conversation and who bears no legal obligation under it." She lifted the second document. "This is a copy of the financial records Thomas kept in his own hand. I made this copy before the estate proceedings concluded. Conrad Wick's name appears in these records twice, not as a creditor, as a facilitator who arranged introductions between Thomas and the men Thomas actually borrowed from, in exchange for a percentage of each transaction." She held the paper steadily. "He never lent Thomas money directly. He was a middleman. The legal obligation, if any existed, was between Thomas and the original lenders, all of whom were addressed in the April settlement. Conrad Wick was not owed money by Thomas Graves. He arranged for other men to lend money to Thomas Graves and collected a fee for that service." A silence had settled over the section of street where they stood. Not a hostile silence, the silence of people who were listening to something and reorganizing what they thought they knew. Conrad's pleasant expression had thinned, not disappeared entirely. The mask was too practiced for that, but thinned, the way thin ice thins before it gives. "Those records," he said carefully, "cannot be verified." "They are in Thomas's handwriting," she said. "If you would like to dispute that, there are people in Independence who can confirm it. The lawyer who conducted the estate proceedings has seen the originals." She lifted the third document. "This is the document you presented to me at Blackstone Ranch 4 days ago. The one your associate asked me to sign. It purports to record a debt of $420 owed by Thomas Graves to parties unnamed and states that I assumed that debt by virtue of marriage." She placed it beside the second document, edges touching. "And this is my signature from the employment agreement I signed with Garrett Vane on the day I arrived at Blackstone Ranch." She held both papers up together. "I am inviting anyone who would like to compare these two signatures to come and look at them." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Lyle Pratt moved. He stepped forward, not toward Mabel but toward the documents. He was a professional. He had the training for this. He looked at both signatures for approximately 10 seconds. He looked at them the way a man looks at something when his professional reputation is the thing being measured against what his eyes are telling him. He stepped back. He didn't return to Conrad's side. He moved sideways, 2 deliberate steps, and stood alone. It was a small movement. In terms of distance, it was perhaps 4 feet. In terms of what it communicated to everyone watching it, was considerably more significant. A man hired by Conrad Wick had looked at the evidence Mabel Holt had placed in front of him and had declined to continue standing beside Conrad Wick. Conrad saw it. She watched him see it. "The document you brought to my employer's ranch," Mabel said, "has a forged signature. The claim it supports does not correspond to any legal obligation I hold. You have spent 5 days in this town telling people that I am a woman of disreputable history who concealed assets from a court proceeding, and that the ranch that employs me is in a state of financial collapse. Both of those statements are false. You have made them for the purpose of pressuring me into paying you money you are not owed for a debt that was never yours to collect." She lowered the documents. "That is slander," she said. "I have the documentation to respond to it. What do you have?" The word slander moved through the watching group the way words with legal weight always move through a crowd slowly, with gravity, each person turning it over privately. Conrad was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than any of his silences had lasted before. She watched him look for the move that was available from the position he was in and not find one. She watched him understand that the man he had paid to stand beside him was no longer standing beside him. She watched him look at the papers in her hand and at the people on both sides of the street and at Garrett Vane, who had not spoken a word and had not needed to. "You have thought about this very carefully," Conrad said at last. "Since April," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at her with an expression that had finally dropped most of the pleasantness and was showing something closer to the real thing beneath it, which was not rage and not defeat, but the specific acknowledgement of a man who has encountered a situation he cannot extract value from and is deciding to leave it in. "Thomas always said you were more capable than he gave you credit for," he said. Thomas was right about that. She said, he was right about very little else, but he was right about that. Conrad looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned, collected his horse from the post where it was tied, and mounted with the same smooth, unhurried movement he had used for everything. Because men like Conrad Wick did not permit themselves to appear rattled even when they were leaving a situation they had lost entirely. Lyle Pratt collected his own horse separately. He did not look at Conrad when he mounted, and he did not ride in the same direction when they left. Mabel stood in the middle of the street and watched until Conrad's horse turned the corner at the far end of the main street and was gone. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. She let the street settle around her, let the sound of ordinary market-day commerce come back into the air, let herself return fully to the ground she was standing on. The watching group dispersed slowly, in the way of people who have seen something they intend to think about later. Carl Brewer from the feed store walked toward her. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and the expression of someone who had listened to 5 days of something and was now in the business of reassessing it. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I owe you an apology. I let that man talk in my store for 3 days without once thinking to ask him what he was carrying in that satchel." She looked at him. She thought about telling him that it did not matter. She thought about telling him that she understood how a confident man with a professional manner could make a story sound true. Both things were accurate, but she had also spent 5 days with Conrad's version of her name in this town, and Carl Brewer's apology was not nothing. "I appreciate that," she said. He nodded and went back to his wagon. Garrett came to stand near her. The distance he kept was the same as always, close enough to be present, far enough to leave her the space of what she had just done. He said, quietly, "You all right?" "I think so." She considered it honestly. "Yes, I think so." He nodded. They stood there for a moment on the quiet street in the October light, and she thought about the woman who had arrived at Blackstone Ranch in August with dust on her clothes, and a case that weighed less than it should have, and a plan sewn into the lining of a coat that most people would have told her was not a plan at all. The plan had been simple. Find ground solid enough to stand on, then stand on it. They rode back to Blackstone in the early afternoon. The conversation between the three of them was sparse and comfortable, the quiet of people who have done something together and do not need to narrate it. The Kansas countryside moved past at the horse's pace, pale and wide and beginning to show the first real colors of October at the edges of things. "Halfway back," Garrett said, "you had those documents organized before you knew exactly how you would need to use them." "I organized them in Independence," she said. "Before I left. I've been carrying them since April." He thought about that for a moment. "You were not running," he said. "No," she said. "I was choosing the place." Silas said nothing, but she saw him nod once, the small nod of a man confirming something he had already concluded. When they rode through the Blackstone gate, Clem Rafferty was on the porch of the bunkhouse with an expression of someone who had been watching the road for the better part of 2 hours and was determined not to let that be obvious. "Everything all right?" he called. "Fine," Mabel said, and dismounted. She unsaddled the horse herself and rubbed him down and turned him into the corral. Then she went to the kitchen and put on the coffee and started on supper, because the men would be in from the range in 2 hours and they needed to eat. She moved through the kitchen with the particular ease that comes from weeks of repetition, the motion so familiar now that her hands knew where everything was before her eyes confirmed it. There was a comfort in that she had not expected when she arrived, the comfort of a space that had been made to work by her own effort and that worked reliably because of it. Garrett came to find her the following morning. He came to the kitchen before breakfast, before the men were up, and he poured himself coffee and sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "I went to see Douglas Marsh yesterday," he said. She looked up. "After Caldwell," he said. "I went to his office in town with the numbers you put together. The analysis of the Morrison contract and the Goss overcharges and the overtime calculation errors. I laid it out the way you laid it out for me." She waited. "He agreed to renegotiate the October payment schedule," Garrett said. 3 additional months. Same interest rate." He paused. "You were right about Marsh. 4 words. She had learned that 4 words from Garrett Vane carried the weight of a paragraph from most men. She nodded and poured her own coffee, and for a moment they sat across from each other in the early morning quiet, and the October light came through the window over the sink at a low angle and lay across the floor between them. And neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. It was Silas who told her, the following week, that Conrad Wick had left Caldwell. He had settled his account at the boarding house on the Saturday evening, after market day, and ridden east. The man at the boarding house said he had not indicated where he was going. He had simply gone. She noted it the way you note that a storm has passed not with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a woman who has been through weather and come out intact. The fence needed mending in places. The work was still there. She went back to it. October moved through Blackstone with the weight of hard months. The men came in from longer days, colder and more tired, and she adjusted accordingly heavier bread. Soups that had been on the range since morning. Coffee kept going from 4 in the morning until 9 at night. She started making a pudding on Fridays using the last of the dried fruit and brown sugar and cinnamon. And Clem Rafferty declared it the best thing he had eaten since his mother's kitchen, and then looked briefly stricken by the emotion that statement produced in him. "You should write to her," Mabel said. He looked at the wall. "She passed 2 years back." He said, "Eastern fever." "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged with the elaborately casual manner of a young man who had not yet learned any more graceful way to carry grief. She gave him a larger serving of pudding without making anything of it, and he ate it without speaking. And that was enough. She had been at Blackstone 3 months when she began the teaching more deliberately. Clem had been the beginning of it. Those afternoons when he appeared at the kitchen door and she had found herself explaining the inventory system not just as instruction, but as reasoning. This is why it works this way. This is what fails when it is done wrong. She had watched his face when he understood the logic, the specific quality of attention that appears in someone when a system becomes visible to them for the first time. And she had thought, this is more important than I have been treating it. She began with Clem on Saturday mornings. The kitchen accounts, the inventory rotation, how to read a bill of lading and check it against what was actually delivered, how to calculate forward how much would 16 men need through a Kansas winter, how to account for the weeks when supply wagons could not get through, how to maintain a margin that protected the operation against the unexpected. A hand named Aldous Prentice, 23 years old, who rotated through kitchen stock duty, began staying after his shift to ask questions. She answered them. A week later, he brought a third man with him, Rufus Cole, who was older and quieter and had the specific attentiveness of someone who had been doing things by instinct for 20 years and had just realized there was a system underneath the instinct. She did not call it a class. She did not announce it. She simply kept explaining to whoever was in the kitchen with an open expression and enough time. A woman from the neighboring homestead came in November, a widow named Winifred Crane, with a household ledger she could not reconcile and the specific embarrassment of someone who knew the problem was solvable but did not know how to solve it. Mabel sat with her for 3 hours at the kitchen table. Winifred left with a system. She came back the following Saturday with her neighbor, and then the Saturday after that with her neighbor's sister-in-law. And the kitchen table, which had begun as a place where Mabel kept accounts, had become, without being declared as such, something considerably more than that. Silas told her one morning in late November that Garrett had noticed. He watches the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Silas said, from the office window, he does not say anything about it. She kept her eyes on what she was doing. Noted. She said, Sunday came to Blackstone with a different quality than the rest of the week. The way Sundays do in working places, not exactly rest, but a slowing. A breath the operation took before the next week began. She had been doing this weekly accounts at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in early December, the lamp lit against the gray afternoon light. When she heard footsteps on the porch that she recognized now without looking up the particular weight and rhythm of Garrett's boots, the way he walked when he was not going anywhere specific but was moving in the direction of something he had decided on. He knocked on the frame of the open door. She set her pencil down. He came in and sat across from her without asking, which she had long stopped registering as presumption and had started reading as comfort, the ease of a man who had learned he was not entirely unwelcome and had stopped performing uncertainty about it. She waited. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it before I talk myself out of it. She looked at him. His hands were on the table in front of him, the right one turning his coffee cup slowly by the rim, the only sign she had learned to read of something that was costing him more than he was showing. The way you handled Conrad Wick, he said, in Caldwell and before it, I've watched a lot of people face a lot of hard things in this country. I have watched men fold when there was considerably less at stake and considerably less to lose. He paused. I have never watched someone stand in the middle of a street with the truth in their hands and dismantle a man's entire operation without raising their voice or losing their composure. He looked at her steadily. You were afraid, he said. I know that. I could see it afterward, when it was done, but you did not show it while it mattered. That is not a small thing. She was quiet for a moment. I have had practice, she said, at not showing it while it matters. 12 years of practice, and he nodded. He understood what she meant without needing her to say more than that, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He knew when a thing had been said as much as it was going to be said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and brought out something she had not anticipated. He set it on the table between them without ceremony, the way he did most things, a ring, silver, with a small turquoise stone set plainly, without ornamentation. He looked at it for a moment before he spoke. That belonged to my grandmother. He said, I have been carrying it since October. She looked at the ring, then at him. Since October, she said. The day after Caldwell, he said, I watched you ride back through that gate and I knew. I have spent 2 months being certain enough to say it. She looked at the ring again. She was 34 years old, and she had been afraid of precisely this thing, not the ring, not the man, but the act itself. The specific vulnerability of saying yes to a life built with someone else, after the education she had received over 12 years, about what trust could cost a woman who extended it to the wrong man. She had watched Garrett Vane for 3 months. She had watched him in his office and in the yard and at the supper table and across this kitchen table. She had watched him when he was tired and when he was pressed and on the days when something had not gone right with the operation and the edges of his patience showed. She had watched him be the same man in the dark as he was in the daylight, no second ledger, no version kept hidden from the people who might judge it. She had watched him make the harder choice, twice now, of standing where she could still be seen rather than where he would have preferred to be. She understood what that kind of restraint costs a man built the way he was built. It had been a choice, made deliberately, because he understood something about what she needed that most men did not understand or did not care to. Ask me properly, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Mabel Holt, I would like you to marry me, not because this ranch needs managing, though you manage it better than I do, because I would like to build what comes next alongside you, however long that turns out to be, because I have not wanted that with anyone since Clara, and I have stopped being afraid of wanting it. It was not poetic, it was honest, and honesty from this man was worth more than poetry from most. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her hand. It fit. After 2 months of carrying it without measuring, without any reasonable basis for expecting it to, the ring fit her finger as if it had been made for it. They both looked at it for a moment. That should not be possible, she said. No, he said. It should not. She looked up at him. Something in his face had settled in the way that faces settle when a person has set down something they have been carrying for a long time. He held her hand for a moment, not dramatically, just held it with the warmth of someone who understands the weight of what has been agreed to. Silas told me, he said, about what Saturdays have become, about how far it has gone beyond the kitchen. She looked at him. He does not usually report things like that. He does not usually need to, Garrett said. She understood what he meant. She understood the difference between a man who notices something and says nothing, and a man who notices something and decides the time has come to speak. Silas Drum had decided. Garrett smiled. The full version this time, the one she had seen him approach and set aside a dozen times since August, finally arrived unhurried, real, the kind that had nothing of performance in it. She was still looking at it when Clem Rafferty knocked on the kitchen door with a question about the Saturday stock rotation, and she answered the question, and Garrett took his coffee cup and went back to the office, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning and the Kansas afternoon was gray and cold outside the window, and Blackstone Ranch settled into its early evening sounds, and none of it was remarkable, and all of it was exactly what it was. They married in February of 1879, when the worst of the winter had cracked and the light was beginning to stay a little longer each day. Not a large ceremony. Garrett had no interest in one, and she had already had the large kind, with Thomas, with flowers she could not afford, and a dress that cost a month's wages, and a church full of people whose names she had learned specifically for the occasion. She had no desire to repeat any part of that performance. What she wanted was the people she actually wanted present. What she got was exactly that. Silas Drum stood beside Garrett with the expression of a man who would not cry and was finding that ambition more challenging than expected. Clem Rafferty cried openly and without apparent embarrassment, which she found she admired. Winifred Crane, who by now had brought 6 different women to the Saturday kitchen table and had become the kind of friend that forms in places where both people have stopped pretending to be less than they are, stood beside Mabel and adjusted her sleeve repeatedly in the small, unnecessary way of someone who needed their hands to do something. The evening after was warm for February, one of those prairie evenings that arrives before the season has agreed to change. They ate outside, long tables in the yard, and the sound of men fed and at ease rose and fell in the cold air. And Garrett sat beside her and ate 2 plates of everything, because he always ate 2 plates when the food was good and had stopped being modest about it. And at some point during the evening, he put his hand over hers on the table without looking at her or making anything of it. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the gate where she had first walked into Blackstone Ranch in August with dust on her clothes and 1 leather case and the very specific determination of a woman who had decided she was not finished yet. The Kansas prairie spread out in every direction, enormous and indifferent and lit by the last of the February light. The windmill turned slowly in the evening air. The cattle moved in the far pasture. The cookhouse where she had stood at the window on the first night and watched a rider disappear into the dark was lit from inside with the lamp she had left burning. She looked at all of it. She let herself look at it properly for the first time. She had not built an empire. She had built something more specific than that, and more durable, a kitchen that ran correctly, an accounting system that no longer bled money through inattention, a set of skills moving from her hands into the hands of people who would carry them forward into places she had not yet imagined. She had built the conditions under which a struggling ranch had found its footing and held it. She had built a table where women came on Saturday mornings to learn that the knowledge to run their own lives was not out of reach, but right there, available, waiting to be learned. She had also built this a table in a yard in February, and a man's hand over hers, and the sound of 16 people eating well. She had arrived with nothing but her name and her spine and the knowledge, sewn into the lining of her coat, of exactly what was true. It had been enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed the right place to stand. Mabel Holt became Mabel Vane in February of 1879. She kept both names depending on the context, which was her right and her preference, and no one at Blackstone Ranch was ever foolish enough to suggest otherwise.